The year was 1862, deep in the bloody heart of the American Civil War. The small village of Culpeper, Virginia, sat uneasily between Union and Confederate lines. For the families who lived there, every day was uncertain, every night filled with dread. Soldiers marched past their homes, smoke often hung in the air, and the sound of cannon fire in the distance reminded them that peace was a luxury long forgotten. Among the villagers was a 17-year-old girl named Clara Matthews. She was bright, gentle, and full of life. Clara often helped her mother with chores, taught her little brother how to read, and dreamed of a future beyond the war. But on one chilling night, her dreams and her very youth would be stolen in a way no one could have imagined. It was a moonless night when the terror began. Clara had just finished tucking her younger siblings into bed. Her father, already away at war, had left her with the heavy responsibility of protecting her mother and 3 little brothers. They lived in a modest wooden farmhouse near the edge of town. The night was unusually still, so quiet that even the chirping of crickets seemed hushed, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then it came, the sound of hoofbeats, dozens of them, pounding the dirt road like thunder. Clara's heart froze. She rushed to the window and saw dark silhouettes moving fast, soldiers on horseback, their rifles glinting faintly under the dim starlight. Within minutes, the air erupted with chaos. Gunshots cracked through the night. Men shouted orders, women screamed, and the distant glow of fire began to paint the sky red. Union raiders had swept into the village, searching for supplies, food, and livestock. They stormed homes, dragged families into the streets, and set barns ablaze. Clara could hear the pounding on doors, the wails of children, and the guttural cries of men being forced out of their homes at bayonet point. Her mother whispered sharply, "Clara, hide the boys, quickly." Panic surged in her chest as she grabbed her youngest brother Samuel, barely 5 years old, and pressed him against her. The other 2 clung to her skirt, their eyes wide with terror. The family hurried down into the root cellar beneath their house, a cramped and dusty space lined with shelves of jars and sacks of grain. Clara pulled the wooden trapdoor shut just as boots pounded across their porch. Through the cracks, she could see shadows moving, could hear the splintering of their front door as it was kicked open. Inside the cellar, the air was heavy and suffocating. Samuel whimpered softly, and Clara pressed her hand over his mouth, silently begging him to stay quiet. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest, she was certain the soldiers above would hear it. She could hear them stomping through the house, overturning furniture, smashing cabinets. Glass shattered, chairs were thrown, and drawers ripped from their places. The sound of destruction rained down like thunder. Every bang sent a shock of fear through Clara's body. Then came the smell, smoke. The raiders had set fire to a nearby barn, and the acrid scent of burning hay and wood seeped into the cellar. Clara's eyes watered, and her throat tightened. She clutched her brothers, whispering, "It's okay, stay still, stay quiet. I won't let anything happen to you." Her voice trembled, but she forced a calm tone for their sake. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Above them, she heard screams from neighbors being dragged outside. Somewhere nearby, a gunshot cracked, followed by silence. Clara buried her face into her knees, praying silently. She prayed for her father on the battlefield, for her mother sitting rigid in the dark beside her, and for her brothers whose innocence was being ripped away in a single night. Fear did something strange to Clara in those moments. It hollowed her out, made time slow, sharpened every sound and smell. She could hear her brother's tiny breaths, her mother's whispered prayers, and the distant roar of flames consuming the village. She realized, with chilling clarity, that they might not live to see the morning. As the chaos raged, Clara made a silent vow in the cellar. If soldiers found them, she would stand in front of her siblings. She would protect them with her life. Though only 17, she felt decades older in that instant, a child forced into the role of a guardian, her youth stripped by the brutal hand of war. Hours later, the noise began to fade. The hoofbeats grew faint, the shouting diminished, and eventually the night returned to a terrible stillness. Smoke still lingered, and the faint crackle of fire echoed in the distance, but the raiders had moved on. At dawn, Clara slowly lifted the cellar door. Her hands trembled as she pushed it open. What she saw would haunt her forever. The village lay in ruins. Houses smoldered, barns collapsed, livestock scattered, and the once lively streets were empty, scarred by violence. Clara stepped into the pale morning light, her brothers clutching her hands. Something inside her had changed. The fear, the responsibility, the trauma of that night had carved deep lines into her heart, and, as her family would soon discover, also into her very body. When her mother looked at her in the daylight, she gasped. Clara's once youthful face bore faint but undeniable lines, her skin pale and weathered as though touched by decades. By the end of that day, streaks of gray appeared in her dark hair. Her eyes, once bright and innocent, carried the weight of someone who had lived a lifetime in a single night. That night of fear had aged her, not just in spirit but in appearance. And though doctors would never explain how, Clara's story became a living reminder that trauma leaves marks no one can see, and sometimes even those the world cannot ignore. The sun rose slowly over Culpeper that morning, casting pale golden light on a village reduced to silence. The previous night's raid had left homes burned, barns smoldering, and families broken. Survivors emerged cautiously, blinking into the smoke-filled dawn, their faces lined with fear and exhaustion. For some, nothing would ever be the same again. For Clara Matthews, that truth would reveal itself in the most shocking and unexplainable way. Clara stumbled out of the cellar with her mother and brothers, her hands still trembling. She hadn't slept. Fear and the weight of responsibility had kept her awake through the endless hours of chaos. As she led her brothers toward the broken shell of their farmhouse, her mother looked at her with a strange expression, not just of relief, but of shock. "Clara," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it, Mama?" Clara asked, her throat raw from smoke and fear. Her mother reached out and touched her daughter's cheek. The skin, once smooth and soft with youth, now bore faint lines around the eyes and mouth, the kind of creases one might expect to see on a woman decades older. At first, her mother thought it must have been soot or ash, some illusion from the long night. But when she brushed Clara's cheek with her sleeve, the lines did not vanish. They were etched into her skin. As the family stepped outside, neighbors gathered, their faces haggard from the raid. One by one, eyes turned toward Clara. Murmurs rose in the crowd. "Is that Clara?" one woman asked in disbelief. "She looks different, older," another whispered. "Lord have mercy, the war has marked her," an elderly man muttered, crossing himself. Clara felt their stares burn into her. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She reached up to touch her own face, her fingertips tracing the new creases that hadn't been there the day before. When she pulled a strand of her hair into view, her heart sank. Mixed among the dark chestnut strands were streaks of silver gray, shimmering under the sunlight. 17 years old, yet the reflection staring back at her in the shard of broken glass from their ruined home seemed that of a woman in her late 40s. In the weeks that followed, Clara's strange transformation became the subject of endless gossip and speculation. Some neighbors whispered that she had been cursed, punished by God for some unknown sin. Others said the sheer terror of that night had drained the youth from her body, as though fear itself had aged her decades in mere hours. Local doctors came, curious but baffled. One elderly physician examined her carefully, running his hands along her lined skin and studying her graying hair. Finally, he admitted, "I've seen men return from battle looking older than their years, but never something so sudden. There's no explanation for this. Science at the time had no words for what Clara endured. Today, we might connect it to what is known as Marie Antoinette syndrome, a rare condition where sudden trauma causes rapid graying of the hair, and in extreme cases, even skin changes resembling accelerated aging. But in 1862, such knowledge was decades away. To those around her, Clara had become a living mystery. At first, Clara could not bear to look at herself. Each time she caught her reflection in water or glass, she felt a pang of grief. Her youth had been stolen overnight. The laughter, the innocence, the dreams of one day marrying and raising a family, they seemed like illusions now, belonging to someone else entirely. One evening, her mother found her sitting by the fire, staring into a cracked mirror. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I don't even know who I am anymore." Her mother knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Clara, listen to me. You are my daughter. You are the same brave soul who shielded her brothers, who faced the darkest night this village has ever known. Your face has changed, yes, but your heart remains, and it is stronger than ever." Clara wanted to believe her. She wanted to see strength rather than loss in her reflection. But the journey to that acceptance would be long. At first, children avoided Clara, whispering behind her back. Young men who once admired her beauty now looked away, unsure of what to say. She felt herself shrinking, withdrawing from the community. But then something unexpected began to happen. People started coming to her. Widows who had lost husbands in battle, mothers who had lost children, soldiers wounded in the fight. They looked at Clara and saw not a curse, but a mirror of their own suffering. She became someone who understood the weight of trauma in a way words could not express. "Clara," one grieving widow said, clutching her hand, "when I look at you, I see my own pain, but I also see that you're still standing, and it gives me hope that I can stand too." Slowly, Clara realized that her strange transformation carried a purpose. Her aged face was no longer a source of shame but a symbol, a testimony that fear may scar us, but it cannot silence us. Though the doctors never found a cure, and the village never found an explanation, Clara learned to live with her altered appearance. The lines on her face became a reminder of the night she survived, a night when her courage outweighed her terror. She carried her premature aging not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. And over time, whispers in the village changed. Where once people had spoken with pity, they began to speak with reverence. She aged in one night, but it was the night she saved her family. She is living proof that the human spirit can endure anything. Clara, once just a girl, became a legend in her community. No one ever fully explained what happened to Clara Matthews that night in 1862. Was it stress? Was it divine intervention? Or was it simply the uncharted power of the human mind and body under unimaginable fear? Whatever the cause, Clara's transformation carried a message that transcended science and superstition alike. Our scars, seen or unseen, can become the very things that give us strength. By the autumn of 1862, the strange story of Clara Matthews had spread beyond the small village of Culpeper, Virginia. Neighbors whispered it with equal parts fear and fascination. Travelers carried the tale across county lines. A girl of 17 who had aged decades in one night. To some, it sounded like superstition. To others, it was a miracle or a curse. But to the doctors of the era, it was something else entirely. A mystery that defied every scrap of medical knowledge available. Within weeks of Clara's transformation, word reached a Confederate field hospital stationed nearby. Physicians, already hardened by the horrors of battlefield medicine, were intrigued by the strange case. A local doctor, Dr. Josiah Whitcomb, one of the few with training from Philadelphia's medical schools, made the journey to Culpeper to see Clara for himself. Clara sat in the parlor of her damaged home when the doctor arrived, her brothers quietly playing in the corner. She felt a chill as he studied her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Tell me, child," he said gently. "Old are you?" 17, Clara answered softly, lowering her eyes. The doctor paused. His gaze swept over her face. The creases around her eyes, the silver streaks in her hair, the faint sagging of skin. He scribbled notes, muttering under his breath, 17, but with the visage of a woman thrice her age. Dr. Whitcomb examined Clara for hours. He checked her pulse, her eyes, her reflexes. He asked her to recount the night of the raid in vivid detail. When she described the terror, her voice quivered, and the doctor observed how her hands trembled slightly, as though the fear was still alive in her veins. At last, he sat back, sighing heavily. "Your body is healthy. Your heart strong, your blood is steady, and yet your outward appearance betrays all reason. It is as if," he trailed off, searching for words that did not exist, "as if time has marked you without passing." In 1862, medical science had no framework for such a phenomenon. Terms like stress disorders or psychosomatic conditions were decades from common use. Physicians spoke of nervous exhaustion or hysteria, but none of those terms could capture what had happened to Clara. Her case had no name, no explanation, only awe and bewilderment. Soon, more doctors came, each with their own theories. Some insisted Clara must have been ill with a wasting disease like tuberculosis or pellagra, though she showed no symptoms. Others claimed the sudden aging was punishment from God, an outward mark of the inner terror she had endured. A few whispered of witchcraft, recalling old folk tales of women who aged overnight under curses. But Clara's neighbors knew better. They had seen the girl before and after the raid. They had witnessed her face transform as swiftly as night turned into day. No illness, no curse, no superstition could fully explain it. What they were witnessing was something science could not yet understand, the sheer destructive force of human fear on the body. Today, we might look at Clara's story through a different lens. Modern medicine recognizes conditions where severe stress triggers rapid changes in appearance. Leur's Marie Antoinette syndrome, named after the French queen whose hair supposedly turned white the night before her execution. Extreme stress can cause sudden pigment loss in hair, creating streaks of gray. A telogen effluvium, where trauma forces hair into a resting phase, causing sudden shedding or graying. The stress-induced aging research now shows that intense fear and trauma can damage DNA and accelerate the body's biological clock. But in Clara's time, these ideas were unthinkable. Science was still wrestling with basic understandings of infection and anatomy. The idea that the mind and body were so deeply connected, that fear could carve wrinkles into a face overnight, was beyond comprehension. For Clara herself, the endless examinations and whispered conversations weighed heavily. Each doctor's bafflement reminded her that her condition had no cure, no remedy to bring back the face she once knew. Yet in time, she began to see a purpose in their fascination. If science could not explain her, perhaps she could explain herself. She began telling her story openly, the night of terror, the cellar, the prayers, the moment she accepted death, and the dawn that stole her youth. She spoke not with shame, but with courage. Fear did this to me, she told a young soldier recovering from battle wounds. But fear did not take my life, it only changed my face, and I am still here. Her honesty became more powerful than any doctor's theory. People came not to diagnose her, but to learn from her resilience. Clara's inexplicable condition did more than puzzle physicians. It stirred spiritual reflection. Preachers used her story in sermons, declaring that Clara was a reminder of the frailty of life, but also the strength of the soul. Though the body withers, one pastor proclaimed, the spirit shines brighter when it endures the fire. Families who had lost loved ones in the war drew comfort from Clara's presence. If she could survive such trauma and still stand tall, then perhaps they, too, could carry on through their grief. And in this way, her mysterious change became not just a medical anomaly, but a source of hope in a time of despair. Years passed, but Clara's aged appearance remained. Doctors moved on, the war dragged forward, and eventually new generations forgot the details of her transformation. Yet in Culpeper, her story lingered. Children grew up hearing of the girl who aged in one night, and adults remembered her as a figure of quiet strength. Science never solved the riddle of Clara Matthews. To this day, her case might be chalked up as one of history's rare examples of stress-induced aging. But perhaps the greater truth is this: some mysteries are not meant to be explained fully by science. Clara's story reminds us that the mind and body are bound together in ways we still do not fully understand. And in that mystery lies a lesson far greater than medicine could ever offer. That fear may mark us, but it cannot define us. The first months after Clara's transformation were the hardest of her life. She was only 17, yet each time she passed a mirror or caught her reflection in a window, she saw a stranger staring back at her. An older woman with graying hair and deep lines etched across her face. The girl she once had been, lively, full of dreams, with a smile that lit up her small Virginia village, seemed lost forever. In her place stood someone marked by trauma, someone whose body betrayed secrets she had never asked to carry. At first, Clara withdrew from the world. She avoided gatherings, declined visits from neighbors, and shunned the curious stares that followed her everywhere she went. When she did step into town, Whispers trailed behind her like shadows. There she is, the girl who aged overnight. Poor child, cursed by God himself. She'll never find a husband now. Every word cut her deeper than the last. Clara had never asked to become a spectacle. She longed to be normal again, to walk unnoticed, to live as a simple girl with ordinary hopes. Nights were the worst. Alone in her room, she would weep quietly, her fingers tracing the creases around her eyes, wondering why fate had chosen her. She prayed for healing, but morning always came with the same reflection. One evening, as autumn leaves fell outside her window, Clara's mother sat beside her and took her hands gently. "My dear," her mother said softly, "you have been given something heavy to carry. But it is not a punishment. It is a mark of survival." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama, I've lost everything. Who will ever look at me the same? Who will ever want me?" Her mother lifted her chin and looked into her eyes. "Those who matter will not look at your face. They will see your courage. You are still Clara, the girl who kept her brothers safe when the world burned around you. That is not something to hide. That is something to share." Those words, spoken with the quiet strength of a mother's love, began to plant a seed within Clara. It was not easy, but slowly Clara forced herself back into the life of her community. At first, she went only to church, sitting in the back pew with her family. The stares still came, the whispers still floated around her, but she held her head high, even when her heart quaked inside her chest. One Sunday, a neighbor approached her after service, a widow named Mrs. Harding, whose husband had been killed at Antietam. With tears in her eyes, the woman clasped Clara's hands and said, "When I see you, child, I see my own pain reflected. But I also see that you are still here, and if you can stand after all you endured, then maybe I can too." Those words struck Clara like a lightning bolt. For the first time, she realized her suffering might serve a greater purpose. Her strange, unwanted transformation was not only her burden, it was also her testimony. From that day forward, Clara began to share her story more openly. She spoke to grieving families who had lost sons in the war. She comforted children who had nightmares of raids and battles. She told them of the night she thought she would die, of the terror that froze her bones, and of the dawn that changed her forever. But she did not end her story in despair. Instead, she spoke of resilience. "Yes, I lost my youth," she would say, "but I did not lose my life, and so long as we live, there is always hope." The villagers began to see her differently. Where once they saw a tragic curiosity, now they saw a woman of strength, a living example of endurance in the face of unimaginable fear. As the war dragged on, Clara found herself drawn to helping the most vulnerable. She began working with orphans, children who had lost parents to the battles that scarred Virginia's fields. She fed them, clothed them, and most importantly, told them stories that reminded them they were not alone. "Your scars may not show on your face like mine," she would tell them, "but they are real all the same, and yet those scars can be the very proof that you survived." The children loved her. They clung to her, not caring about her silver hair or the lines on her skin. To them, she was a motherly figure, someone who understood their pain and gave them hope for tomorrow. Clara still had moments of sorrow, nights when she longed for the girl she had once been, but with each passing year, she learned to wear her unusual appearance, not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of honor. When people asked about her face, she no longer looked away. She met their gaze and answered simply, "This is what survival looks like." And in that answer lay the heart of her strength. Clara Matthews may have lost her youth in a single night, but she gained something far more lasting, the power to inspire. Her tragedy became her strength, her wound became her witness, and her altered face became a lantern for others walking through their own darkness. She proved that the worst nights of our lives do not have to end us. They can reshape us. Yes, they can leave scars we never asked for, but those scars can also give us the strength to lift others, to light the way, and to stand taller than we ever thought possible. By the time the war ended, Clara was known not as the girl who aged overnight, but as the woman who gave hope to the broken. Her tragedy had not destroyed her. It had forged her into someone greater. Her story endures as a reminder to us all, what feels like the end may only be the beginning of a new kind of strength. By the time the Civil War drew to its bloody close in 1865, Clara Matthews was no longer just the 17-year-old girl who had aged overnight. She had grown into a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, even though her outward appearance still bore the lines and gray hair of someone twice her age. Her tragedy had not faded. Her face never returned to its youthful glow, and whispers about her condition still followed her when strangers came to town. But to those who knew her, Clara was no longer defined by what had happened to her in that single night of terror. Instead, she was remembered for what she had become afterward, a woman whose suffering carried meaning, a figure of resilience whose very presence taught lessons no sermon, no textbook, and no speech ever could. Virginia, like much of the South, was left scarred after the war. Burned homes, broken families, and empty chairs at dinner tables became permanent fixtures of life. In such a world, despair could have easily swallowed entire communities. But Clara became a voice of comfort and endurance. Whenever widows gathered to mourn, she joined them. Whenever children cried for fathers who would never return, she held them. Whenever young men returned from the battlefield, broken in body and spirit, she spoke to them not as a doctor or preacher, but as someone who bore her own scars openly. Her message was always the same. We do not choose the marks life gives us, but we can choose what we do with them. Will we hide in shame, or will we rise and carry them as proof of our strength? These words, born of her own pain, resonated deeply. People began to travel from neighboring towns just to hear her speak. She never sought fame, yet her story spread. Carried from mouth to mouth, retold at firesides and in church pews, the children Clara helped during and after the war grew up remembering her kindness. Many had lost everything, yet they recalled how Clara gave them warmth when the world seemed coldest. She became a second mother to dozens, perhaps hundreds of orphans and displaced children. One boy, who later became a schoolteacher, wrote in his journal, "I remember her silver hair and lined face, not with fear, but with comfort. She looked like sorrow itself, but she spoke like hope. When she told us we would survive, I believed her, because she had survived herself." In time, these children passed her story to their own children, weaving it into family lore. Clara's name became a symbol in Culpeper, not of tragedy but of courage. In the early years, Clara had been the subject of cruel gossip. Some said she was cursed, others that she was marked by God's wrath. But decades later, her reputation had shifted completely. Now people told her story with reverence. She bore her pain openly, they said, and turned it into a lesson for us all. Neighbors would recall how she walked through town with her head held high, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking. Children pointed to her not in fear but in admiration. To them, she was living proof that strength is not about the face we wear, but about the spirit we carry. Clara lived to the age of 68. By the end of her life, she had become a local legend. Mothers told their daughters, "Remember Clara Matthews, the girl who aged overnight but never gave up." Fathers told their sons, "When you face hardship, think of Clara. She carried her scars with pride." Her name was spoken in weddings, funerals, and town meetings as an example of resilience. She became a story parents told children on stormy nights, a reminder that even in darkness, survival is possible. And her influence stretched beyond her small Virginia town. Travelers who heard her story carried it elsewhere. Ministers used her life as a parable of endurance. Writers recorded her tale in faded ink, preserving it for future readers. Though Clara never sought recognition, she became more than just a woman. She became a lesson. Clara's story, passed down through generations, carries timeless truths that remain relevant even today. 1. Suffering changes us, but it does not destroy us. Clara's face bore scars of fear, but her soul remained unbroken. 2. Strength is not measured by outward beauty. Clara lost her youthful glow but gained a depth of character that outshone appearances. 3. Your scars can be someone else's hope. By sharing her pain, she gave countless others courage to endure their own. 4. Legacy is built not by perfection, but by perseverance. Clara's lasting impact was born not of what she lost, but of how she lived afterward. These lessons, once whispered in small Virginia homes, Now speak to all who face struggles too heavy to bear. In the end, Clara's aging overnight was not just a medical mystery or a tragic twist of fate. It was a turning point that revealed the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Her tragedy became her strength, her suffering became her story, and her story became a legacy that outlived her by generations. Even now, more than a century and a half later, Clara Matthews stands as a reminder. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can always choose what it means. The face of the girl who aged overnight may have shocked her neighbors, but the strength she carried afterward inspired them for decades. That is the lesson Clara gave, not just to her own generation, but to all who came after. By the end of her long and remarkable life, Clara Matthews had become more than a curiosity, more than a medical mystery, and more than a local legend. She had become a symbol. The story of the 17-year-old girl who aged overnight had traveled far and wide, but what lingered most was not the strangeness of her transformation. It was the wisdom she carried because of it. For Clara herself, the greatest lesson was simple but profound. Our scars, whether they are visible on our skin or hidden deep within us, are not the end of our story. They can be the very beginning of our strength. All her life, Clara lived with a face that reminded her daily of that terrifying night in 1862. The lines on her skin and the silver in her hair were like a mirror that refused to let her forget. But instead of letting that reflection crush her spirit, she transformed it into something greater. Each line she once told a gathering of children is a story written by survival. And if I can survive the night the world seemed to end, then you can survive whatever comes for you. Clara had learned that the body can change, appearances can wither, and beauty can fade, but the soul, when fortified by courage, only grows stronger. Doctors never solved the riddle of Clara's condition. Historians, years later, would debate whether her case was an example of Marie Antoinette syndrome, stress-induced aging, or something else entirely. But in the end, the medical details mattered far less than the moral. The mystery gave her story power, but the meaning gave it life. Clara's experience revealed that human beings are not defined by what happens to them. Instead, they are defined by how they respond. Clara never married, though she was loved by many. She dedicated her life to service, to orphans, widows, and wounded soldiers who returned home broken in body and spirit. When she died in 1913 at the age of 68, the entire town of Culpeper turned out for her funeral. The preacher who delivered her eulogy said, "Some live long lives and leave little behind." But Clara lived with scars the world could see, and through them, she taught us how to endure. Her face may have aged overnight, but her courage will live for generations. Children she had once cared for wept openly. Now grown men and women who brought their own families to pay respects. They told their sons and daughters, "This is the woman who showed us what strength looks like." Clara's story still whispers across the centuries with lessons that have not grown old. 1. Pain does not define you. Clara bore her scars for life, yet they became her testimony, not her identity. 2. Survival is victory. Even when life robs us of something precious, youth, dreams, loved ones, the very act of surviving gives us the chance to rebuild. 3. Strength is contagious. By sharing her pain openly, Clara gave others permission to face their own. 4. The human spirit is greater than fear. Terror aged Clara's body, but it could not age her courage. These truths are as relevant today as they were in the war-torn 1860s. Each of us, in our own way, will face a night of fear. It may not be a raid or a war, or the sudden loss of youth, but it will be something that shakes us, something that threatens to steal our hope. When that night comes, Clara's story asks us a question: what will we do with our scars? Will we hide them, ashamed of what they reveal? Or will we, like Clara, carry them openly as proof that we survived? Her life teaches us that scars are not signs of weakness, but of battles endured and overcome. Clara once told a young man who had returned from battle with a missing arms, "You think you are broken because people can see your wound. But I tell you, it is the wound that makes your courage visible. Without it, they would never know how strong you are." In those words lay her final gift: perspective. Where others saw tragedy, she saw testimony. Where others saw loss, she saw legacy. And that shift in perspective was what turned her from victim to victor. Generations after Clara's death, her story continued to be told. Teachers spoke of her in classrooms, preachers wove her life into sermons, and families retold her legend around hearths and tables. The story of the girl who aged overnight was not just about a strange medical mystery. It was about the human ability to rise above what should have broken us. Even today, in a world far removed from the battlefields of the Civil War, Clara's torch still burns. Each of us carries fears, traumas, and scars that feel too heavy. Yet Clara whispers across time, "You are more than your scars. You are stronger than your fear. You can turn your pain into someone else's hope." Clara's life can be summed up in this: pain may change our faces, our bodies, and even the course of our lives, but it cannot change our worth. She proved that survival itself is an act of triumph, that scars can shine brighter than untouched skin, and that the human spirit can endure far more than we ever imagine. Her face told the world a story of tragedy, but her life told the world a story of strength. That is the true message she left behind, and it is a message for all of us.